Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first of our 2021 Trenchard lectures. These lectures are held in conjunction with the Royal Aeronautical Society. I do want to make a point of saying thank you very much for their ongoing support. We hope to return in person in 2022 to the Royal Aeronautical Society. Tonight we've got Dr. Kathleen Sherit with us, who's going to talk about pioneering female aviators in the regular RAF. For those of you who are regular followers of our lectures, you'll be wondering why I look smart, as I usually don't. And that is because after Kath's lecture and before the Q&A, we will be hosting our academic award winners virtually. It'll take about 5 minutes. We're going to celebrate their achievement. So that's what's coming up. But for now, we have Dr. Kathleen Sherit, who I'm absolutely delighted to be joining us. Kathleen holds a PhD in contemporary British history from King's College London, and she's previously served in the RAF for 22 years as a training specialist. She studied at the Joint Service College and at the Royal College of Defence Studies. And Kathleen's written a number of articles, which, amongst other places, have appeared in the Royal Air Force Historical Society Journal and the British Journal for Military History. And she's the author of Women in the Front Line, British Service Women's Path to Combat, which was published in 2020 and is a fantastic read. I strongly recommend it to anyone who is interested in the subject. So I'm really pleased that Kath's going to join us, but I'm also pleased that you are all joining us. And I should say we have people tonight joining us from Turkey, Toronto, and even Twickenham. So wherever you're coming from, thank you very much for being with us. But I'm now going to bring Kath onto the stage. Oh. Hello, Kath.
Hello, Harry.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and hello, everybody. I want to start then, the next slide, please, Harry, for the copyright. Thank you. I want to take you back to the 1st of June 2007, and the location is Iraq. Next slide, please. Called to an emergency, Merlin helicopter pilot Michelle Goodman and her crew were quickly airborne and flying to the centre of Basra city to evacuate a critically injured casualty. Goodman later recollected, even with night vision goggles, visibility was very poor. At low level, we worried about wires and masts, as well as enemy fire. None of us knew the landing site. We were on the ground for 5 minutes, with rockets getting closer. As we rose above the rooftops, 4 rocket-propelled grenades were fired at us. We got the casualty to the hospital 15 minutes after the call-out. Goodman embodied a promise made in the House of Commons by Philip Noel Baker, the Secretary of State at the Air Ministry in 1947, that the RAF would train female pilots when circumstances permitted. But the proposal was scuppered at the time by opponents who argued that it would be costly. Women would waste valuable training places needed for men. Anyway, women, being considered non-combatant, could only fly passenger aircraft, and passengers, of course, would have no confidence in a female pilot. So the idea was dropped, and circumstances didn't permit until 1989. Now, Britain did have female pilots in the Second World War. They flew for the Air Transport Auxiliary under the Ministry for Aircraft Production, not as part of the RAF. The Air Ministry refused to second members of its Women's Auxiliary Air Force to fly for the ATA. However, after the war, ATA women were allowed to join the RAF's volunteer reserve as pilots. This reserve flying closed to women in the 1950s when the budget was cut. A combination of factors brought about policy change in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and I can say something about that later in question time if you like. But the purpose of my talk this evening is to describe the experience of pioneering women who responded to call for volunteers for pilot and navigator roles. Initially, to avoid women taking up combat flying, they would be eligible only for aircraft deemed as non-combatant. That is, they didn't carry weapons, the transport fleet, some helicopters and training aircraft. Then in December 1991, with a degree of reluctance, Air Marshal Roger Palin recommended that restrictions on aircraft type be lifted. All roles were open to women, If they were good enough, they would fly combat jets. But who would come forward, and what would they face in the elite part of the RAF? Drawing on interviews and official documents, I'll explain their motivation, training, the pernicious effect of publicity, and experience on squadrons. Next slide, please. Starting with some introductions. The first two navigators, Anne-Marie Houghton and Wendy Nichols, and three pilots. Next slide. Julie Gibson, the first to qualify, Joe Salter, the first combat-ready fast jet pilot, and Dawn Hadlow, the first flying instructor. These are the names the women used at interview, and I will use today. When they undertook flying training, three were known by their maiden names: Anne-Marie Dorr, Wendy Smith, and Dawn Bradley. Born in the mid or late 1960s, these women emerged from the school system in the early 1980s. Four went to university. Houghton went straight into the RAF at age 18. Julie Gibson, the oldest of the group, grew up in a naval family. A flight in a light aircraft at age 15, followed by 2 years in her school's combined cadet force, the Navy section, inspired her love of flying. Gibson's timing was fortunate. Prompted by the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act, cadet organizations in schools opened to girls in 1976. In 1980, she went to City University in London to study aeronautical engineering, and wanting to fly, she applied for full membership of the University of London Air Squadron, rather than for social membership then available to women. Next slide, please, Harry. University air squadrons were a key source of young men who would join the RAF to be pilots after graduating. As women couldn't be RAF pilots, then training them to fly at university was considered to be a waste of a place more appropriately awarded to a young man, thus echoing post-war reasoning. So Gibson was rejected. She wrote to her MP and was told that women couldn't be RAF aircrew because they were excluded from combat roles and because of the improbability of amortizing training costs before marriage or motherhood. Indeed, at the time, pregnant service women were dismissed. Although women in civilian employment had maternity leave rights, in the armed forces, maternity leave wasn't allowed. Gibson recalled, "I felt that the argument for female aircrew wasn't really being given full consideration. Other countries like the United States were having women flying. It was just disappointing. It just wasn't a good enough reason." Indeed, Britain had fallen behind allied nations. The USA opened flying roles in the mid-70s, Canada in 1978. Wendy Nichols was also disappointed at St Andrews University in 1982. She said, "I got completely seduced by the University Air Squadron. I had this yen to fly. When I said I'd like to fly, they were completely appalled. You can't do that, you're a woman. So I wandered along to the officer training course, or the army equivalent, and they said, oh, you can spend your spare time driving armored vehicles, playing at soldiers, whatever. It's great. They don't say that we can't do anything because we're female." So Nichols spent her undergraduate years in the OTC, joined the army after university, and then at Sandhurst encountered the gender barrier. "I got right towards the end of my training," she told me. "Then there was a careers interview. What do you want to do? I still naively thought I could do what I want. I wanted to go into intelligence. And there was this snort of derision. You can't do that, you're a woman. Well, I thought I've heard all this before from the University Air Squadron. I couldn't believe I was hearing it again." She left the army, but still attracted to a career in the armed forces, she joined the RAF. Policy was on the cusp of change. Although the armed forces were exempt from the employment clauses of the Sex Discrimination Act, they were expected to comply with those that referred to the provision of goods and services. Education, and therefore the cadet schemes at universities, was supposed to be equal access. Pressure built up, and the Ministry of Defence conceded that University Air Squadron flying should be open to women from the autumn of 1985, with a quota of 10% of the places. So a pool of proven female pilots built up, talent that the RAF came under pressure to employ. In 1989, with concerns over the quality of men applying to be pilots and navigators, the door was open to women. Would the RAF learn from Allied nations' experience? In April 1990, at a NATO conference on female aircrew, Commander Linda Hutton of the United States Navy advised the audience of problems that might emerge when introducing female aircrew. Instructors could be belligerent or overbearing, seeking failure. Canadian pilot Major Deanna Brasseur warned of harmful attitudes of male trainees, colleagues who, when drunk, expressed contempt, calling women fat, ugly dykes, looking for husbands, looking for national acclaim, trying to prove that men are not that great. So how did it work out in the RAF? Photographic interpreter Wendy Nichols, supplier Anne-Marie Houghton, and armament engineer Julie Gibson responded to the call for volunteers in August 1989. Next slide, please. Nichols and Houghton were selected for navigator training and reported to RAF Finningley that autumn. Ground school simulator sessions, then training on the Bulldog, the Dominie, and a phase on the Jet Provost for low-level flying. Students were then streamed, with the most capable being selected for fast jet training. Although Houghton thought that women were accepted by staff and fellow students, nevertheless, she revealed their nickname for themselves, the Exclusive Society of Social Outcasts, hinting that being pioneers wasn't simple. She remembered a bit of animosity because female students couldn't go to fast jets and so would take multi-engine aircraft jobs. It was the borderline male students that resented the women. As Houghton recollected, these were young men, testosterone-fueled, and we were taking their jobs in their minds, some of them. You're only getting through because you're girls, was the accusation. But although not eligible for fast jets, the female students had done the full course, and it wasn't their fault they couldn't be selected for the top stream. As for a guaranteed pass, that also wasn't the case. Houghton completed on time, Nichols repeated part of the course, and a third woman withdrew from training. Houghton would have loved fast jets, but set her sights on a tactical Hercules squadron. Nichols, completing training shortly after Houghton, was delighted to get Hercules as well. Next slide, please. Julie Gibson's experience as one of the first candidates in pilot training was problematic, and this slide illustrates the training pattern for pilots in 1989. Elementary flying, or straight onto basic flying, streaming onto fast jet, multi-engine or rotary aircraft, and then on through specialist courses towards operational readiness. Next slide, please. So in case you couldn't get the whole slide on your screen, I've enlarged the lower section for you. Now, keen for early success, the authorities exempted Gibson from elementary flying because over a period of years, she had accrued 30 hours of private flying lessons. So she was fast-tracked onto basic flying at Linton-on-Ouse, where her male colleagues had 90 hours from University Air Squadron days or 60 hours from the elementary course in their logbooks. Next slide, please. Gibson told me, "It has always been a regret that it happened that way. I probably didn't realize that I didn't have a solid foundation until I started. It was incredibly stressful for the first 2/3 of the course. I guess I just had some really good instructors who wanted to help. I did have extra hours at that stage, and I very nearly withdrew because of the pressure. I was probably persuaded to stick with it, and I'm pleased that I did." Extra hours awarded at the discretion of the chief instructor were a way of boosting the chances of a borderline student. Some male trainees thought women were given preferential treatment when it came to extra flying, and it created friction. But as Air Vice Marshal Bob Honey explained to me, if you had someone who came in and was really, really trying, then you would give him the benefit of the doubt. There was always a small number of extra hours. Others who weren't trying terribly hard, and there was a tendency then to say, well, you're not doing very well, and you're not really trying, so why should we persevere? But get someone with a good attitude, and you gave them a bit more time. Gibson displayed the necessary attitude and was given more time, the system perhaps compensating for having fast-tracked her in the first place. She was selected for the multi-engine stream and went to Finningley for the next course, conducted on the Jetstream aircraft. She said, the nature of that course was completely different from basic training. I suffered a bit at the time with confidence, but nothing like the difficulties at Linton. Actually, I quite enjoyed it at Finningley. There were female navigators there, and they had taken a lot of the brunt of the arrival of women aircrew. Got my wings in June 1991. From there, Gibson went to RAF Northolt to fly Andover passenger aircraft on 32 Squadron. Next slide, please. Meanwhile, Jo Salter was well into her training. Theoretically, as a Royal Military College of Science undergraduate studying electronic systems engineering, Salter could have flown with the University Air Squadron. But as she recollected, she had a nasty encounter when she went for a visit. The guy just said, "Oh, here's a girl. You've got to sleep with the instructors if you want to fly around here." I think it was based on there being a relationship going on somewhere. Anyway, I decided not to go back. Graduating in 1989, she went for aircrew selection at Biggin Hill while on her officer training course at Cranwell. On passing out as an officer, she was told she'd been selected for pilot training, and she went to the elementary flying course at Swinderby. She remembered, "I didn't go solo on time. I was put on review and had an instructor change. The two instructors were very different. The first was so experienced and had been used to successfully training men. The second, an Australian, was very different. He said to me, 'I don't know why you haven't gone solo. I know that you can.' So immediately my attitude swapped from 'I'm a failure, I can't do it' to 'oh, I can do it.' Years later, I realized that this was just clever instructional technique. I've spoken to instructors since who said you can just tell the guys, but when they flew with me, they discovered that I wanted to understand. Why was I doing it this way? What was the benefit? Success at Swinderby led to basic flying training at Cranwell. And Salter explained that partway through, students were streamed, and she described the process. They take this sheet with all your scores from all your tests and how well you've done, with your photo and your name. Where should we send this pilot? My flight commander told me this story. Yes, we'll send her multi-engine. So he covered my face and name and said, where would you send this pilot? And they said, well, we'd send this pilot fast jet because the scores are fast jet. But it's a girl, so we can't. But he convinced them. They said to me, you can go to Valley, but afterwards you can only be an instructor. You can't go to the front line. Like Houghton, Salter found that her success rankled with a young man who didn't make the fast jet stream. There was one guy who was a bit funny with me, she said, but I'd got better scores than he had, and they were all quite public. It wasn't that I was getting extra hours. I was a good pilot, and I was doing well. Next slide, please. So to Valley and training on the Hawk. Jo Salter explained, everything speeds up. The whole environment is different. There'd already been a girl there, so I don't really remember it being much of an issue. But on the very last trip at Valley, one of the guys failed. I remember him being funny with me again because I had passed. I remember just feeling at the time that it might be a gender thing, but he was funny with everyone because, of course, he was very disappointed. Salter was awarded wings on the 3rd of April 1992, winning the Best Overall Student Prize, the British Aerospace Trophy. Salter's timing was important. Just 4 months earlier, restrictions on roles for women were lifted. She could now go on to RAF Brawdy for the tactical weapons phase of training, the second woman to reach this phase, but the first to succeed. The candidate ahead of her, Sally Cox, was taken off this demanding course. Salter remembered a much more mature course. When I went down there were only 2 of us youngsters. The other 4 members of the course were all experienced men changing role. The average age suddenly shot up by about 7 or 8 years, and I think this made a difference. But not entirely mature, as she remembered, lots of period jokes. It gets very boring, she said. It must be the time of the month. Eventually I said, right guys, I've had yet another it must be the time of the month. Been here 3 months. I must have had 3 periods. If you can tell me the dates, feel free to share. And if you can't, then shut up. The issue followed her around. Later, she said, when I went to Valley as a tactics instructor, I had someone come up to me and say the same, a full 5 years on. And the jokes didn't stop. I just got tired of them and tired of fighting the battle. The idea that women's flying would be impaired on a monthly basis was a common belief not borne out by experience. Likewise, there were rumours that G-forces experienced when flying fast jets would cause problems with the womb. This also wasn't true. Indeed, women could be at an advantage because evidence from the USA suggested that people of shorter stature cope better with G-forces than taller people. The physical attribute that was a legitimate cause of concern was weight. Some women were too light for ejection seat parameters, and so were at greater risk of serious injury than men. Dawn Hadlow, also selected for fast jets, thought that women being keen to fly would not have withdrawn from training because of this increased risk. Risk was an accepted factor in military flying. Returning to Salter, she also had a worrying encounter with an instructor. I remember going into one debrief, and he just said, "I'm going to make you cry. That's what I'm in here for, and you're going to leave here crying." However much I felt like it, she said, "Oh my God, I didn't." Salter was successful and was posted to the Tornado GR1 with 617 Squadron. Next slide, please. Dawn Hadlow found Brawdy a big step up. She recollected, "I did get a few hours remedial for air combat. That wasn't my forte. I deservedly went on review for it." In other words, she had to fly a sortie again to pass. I guess I wasn't surprised. I then had 2 hours to sort it out or be chopped. If you didn't get it within a couple of hours of review, that was that. I went again and passed. It was quite normal for students to go on review. Hadlow drew on the camaraderie of her fellow students, and while she felt instructors and the squadron boss wanted her to succeed, she was not aware at the time that a senior officer at Brawdy had a different perspective on female fast jet pilots. Many years later, she was told this man suggested to the instructors that they nip this in the bud, chaps. She told me, "I'm very glad I didn't know that at the time, because that would have been a fairly unpleasant situation." But I gather that most of the instructors were fairly disgusted with that attitude. They'd seen that on the whole I was a good pilot. Yes, it may have been a glitch, but this man obviously had me in his sights. I guess I'd be naive if I thought everyone welcomed women with open arms, but that was quite nasty actually. I think you walked a tightrope. You had to be seen to be not weak, but also not too strong as a woman. They didn't like that. Keep a low profile, do your thing, don't make a fuss. If I'd known there was an agenda with this chap at the time, that would perhaps have increased the pressure on me when I was on review. Like Joe Salter, Dawn Hadlow was selected for the Tornado GR1. As events worked out, she initially became an instructor on Tucano. Flying training is a very individualistic experience, everyone concentrating on their own performance. But as the stories reveal, these early candidates encountered the additional pressures that Commander Hutton and Major Brasseur had highlighted, from instructors seeking failure to young men fearing that women were getting jobs they would otherwise have filled. And we're left to imagine behaviours glossed over by expressions such as nasty to me or funny with me. These women did not emphasise attitudinal problems. They were candid about their own performance in learning to fly and appreciative of instructors who made a difference. But one issue in particular marked them out as different from the men: publicity. At the NATO conference, Hutton and Brasseur had warned about media coverage. Hutton summarised, media appearances took time better used for studying. They created jealousy and bitterness as men didn't get the same recognition. Consequently, women could be isolated from their colleagues. Brasseur recommended that events should include the men and women should be guided on handling media questioning. Next slide, please. From the Ministry of Defence perspective, publicity was a reward for its new policy, a chance to highlight the RAF as a modern, egalitarian employer, a chance to attract applicants. The women shared a loathing of publicity, and none were given media training, nor was it addressed with their fellow course members. Some of the ideas were wacky, or indeed tacky. Wendy Nichols summed up her feelings years later. I resented it. Anything that smacked of marking us out as different really irritated me. I probably gave the press a hard time, and now I see that was probably wrong because I had a responsibility that I didn't realise. I was trailblazing for people that came behind, and the press was only doing its job. But I didn't like the intrusion. Later, attention moved on to her personal life when she and a pilot on her squadron were to marry. Somehow a reporter had got wind of this and phoned me, she said. We hear you're going to get married. It's the first time a pilot and navigator have got married. Would you get married in the air, and can we cover the story? Can the captain marry you? That facile kind of reporting I really hated. Official ideas seemed to hit rock bottom when Salter and Hadlow were at Broady on the tactical weapons course. The focus had shifted to them once Sally Cox had been suspended from training. As Hadlow recollected, they sent down this female officer to try and sweet talk us into doing publicity. Television programme, so naff I can't believe it. Getting us to shop in the fashion store Dorothy Perkins for frilly underwear, and the next shot is us flying fast jets. Fairly nauseating stuff. But in common with the other services, there was an imperative to emphasise that service women retained their femininity, even as they trained for combat. Hadlow went on, I thought this course is pressure enough. You don't need to be doing this to us, it's ridiculous. After both Hadlow and Salter objected to publicity, they were left alone to complete training. Once Salter had achieved combat ready status on 617 Squadron, she was fair game. As she remembered, I got a phone call from the Director of Public Relations. He said we need to do publicity. It'd be much better for us to manage and deal with it. So a press conference was set up with about 100 media coming. We were flown up by Hercules. Photo shoot, fly pass, went worldwide. I'd only been on the squadron about 6 months, and I'm now having this massive media profile. I got a lot of fan mail. So I said, come on guys, I can't manage this on my own. Tried to make it into a bit of a joke, something for all of us, not just for me. Oh, and Julie Gibson piloted the Hercules for the press that day. And you might be ahead of me. Anne-Marie Houghton was the navigator. 2 other crew members were women, all part of the public relations effort. Gibson's own exposure to media demands while struggling with the initial phase of training created more difficulties. She said, I had publicity even before I got to flying training. Just being recruited into aircrew, national television, national papers. Other people in the Air Force would come up and say in a mocking sort of way, can I have your autograph? It was quite horrible. Of course, it's understandable that the RAF wanted positive publicity, But having made that decision, it erred in not helping the women with some training. Their fellow trainees could have been included, lessons it could so easily have learned from its allies. But however problematic the experience, the press coverage was positive, with a focus on achievement, a different story from how women serving in the Navy's warships were treated. And so to squadrons. Although RAF stations were a mixed working environment, squadrons, comprising mostly aircrew and engineers, were overwhelmingly male. The workplace had a male culture, pin-up calendars, swearing, crude jokes, and socializing centered on heavy drinking. Now some squadrons were going to have newly qualified women entering this haven of masculinity. Added to the normal pressures of being an unproven newcomer, these women went to their squadrons as the first female pilots and navigators in regular service. Their reception depended very much on the leadership of senior aircrew, as Joe Salter recollected. Next slide, please. Of the 8 Tornado squadrons, apparently only one commanding officer would accept her, 617 Squadron. Salter felt lucky to be wanted and recollected the importance of her boss's positive attitude when an experienced navigator arrived. He told the squadron boss that he didn't want to fly with the female pilot, but the boss adjusted the flying program so that he had to fly with her. Happily, she developed a good working relationship with the navigator she mostly crewed with, and she recollected he had absolutely no problem whatsoever, but there were a few older, bolder navigators who'd been around a bit who did have a problem with it. People who said, "I don't think you should be here." This latter category included a navigator she flew with whilst policing the Iraqi northern no-fly zone. "You do the chat," she said, "about what's going to happen if you're shot down or something happens." And he said, "Joe, you go that way, and I'm going 180 degrees to whatever direction you go." I just thought to myself, it's easy to talk, really easy to talk. I'm absolutely convinced if we had come down over hostile territory, he wouldn't have been walking in the opposite direction. The last thing you do is leave the only person you know. I had that conversation with myself, she said. But she resented the need to constantly justify her presence. The difficulty I had was that each new person who arrived, I had to go through the same process of saying, "Hi, this is me. I'm here on merit. I can do the job. I'll prove it to you. Just say the 100 jokes that I've heard before. Now can we move on?" Joe Salter's time as a regular RAF pilot came to an end after the birth of her first child. She was serving as an instructor at RAF Valley on Anglesey in North Wales, having completed her tour of duty with 617 Squadron. Although she'd been able to benefit from maternity leave introduced in the early 1990s, a combination of the complexities of career and family circumstances led to Salter deciding to leave. But she joined the reserve and became a flying instructor for the Air Cadets with 6 Air Experience Flight at RAF Benson in Oxfordshire, a role she filled for more than 10 years. Next slide, please. Like Salter, Wendy Nichols also thought newly qualified men were more readily accepted than women, remarking that women weren't. There was always that nagging doubt or suspicion. Is she there because the system needed her to pass, or is she there because she can actually do the job? So we had to re-win the confidence of our male colleagues, and I found that very irritating. But there was nothing I could do about it. I just set to and do it all again. Nichols voiced a common sentiment that in a new job it was assumed that women couldn't do it until they proved they could, whereas for men the assumption was they could unless they demonstrated they couldn't. Working the transport aircraft routes, Nichols also faced cultural clashes, an encounter with an Arabic refueling driver in Riyadh lingering in the memory. He came up onto the flight deck and said, "How much fuel do you require?" And the pilot said, "I don't know, ask the navigator." The driver turned to me and then turned back to the pilot. How much fuel do you require? I thought it was a language thing, so I wrote it down and passed him the note. He screwed the note up and threw it down. Then it dawned on me what the problem was. And the captain said, well, we'll just sit here until you put the amount of fuel in that my navigator tells you that we need. In the end, the Bowser driver got sick of us sitting there. He put the fuel in and off we went. She was pleased to have been so well supported by her captain, who didn't take the easy way out of dealing with the Bowser driver himself, unlike a captain in Julie Gibson's experience. Next slide, please. He reassured a nervous passenger that she wasn't allowed to touch any of the buttons or only press one button or something, which I was quite miffed about. As a co-pilot, actually, you do half the flight, and I didn't think he really needed to say that. Echoes of the 1947 thinking that passengers would be nervous with a female pilot. After her tour with 32 Squadron, Gibson went on to 70 Squadron, flying the Hercules. Now, some years into her flying career, she remembered RAF linemen as being very different from her early experience. There were lots of women, she said, airload masters and navigators on the Hercules, so acceptance was fine. Gibson fulfilled an ambition, becoming the first woman to qualify as a Hercules captain. Next slide, please. Dawn Hadlow's emergence from training coincided with defence cuts, the 1990s. All junior pilots could face lengthy delays, filling in on ground-based jobs until a flying opportunity opened up. Hadlow was told she had a 2-year wait for a Tornado Squadron. Already a gliding instructor and keen to continue flying, she asked to become an instructor instead. Indeed, when she started fast jet training, she expected to become an instructor. So she went to the Central Flying School to qualify and was then posted to Cranwell to instruct on the basic flying training course. Now she had to build a professional relationship with would-be pilots. She said, I was only a year older than some of them. You could have a good time socially, go out for a beer, but you had to be very careful that you didn't undermine your authority, which was true for the chaps as well. You could be matey, as long as they knew you were top dog in the air and on the squadron. But there was never really any issue, because most of them were just grateful to be flying and they weren't going to upset the apple cart. At the end of her tour of duty, now with a fitness concern, she went to the multi-engine aircraft stream rather than pursuing her earlier selection for Tornado. She recollected, I was keen to get on to a squadron, get on with another job. So go to the multi-engine school at Finningley was a delight. They were a fantastic bunch of people. She subsequently joined 32, by then the Royal Squadron, as an HS-125 pilot, which she loved, particularly flying as crew rather than as instructor and student, which had governed her flying experience previously. But with continued defence cuts, her thoughts turned to civilian life. Although I'd had a wonderful time, a fantastic time, it was quite wearing, always being the only female in the cockpit. It was lovely, but after 10 years of that, it took its toll in a way that it might not have done with girls who'd gone through together, or, for example, groups of women in the ATA in the war. We really were, one or two of us, on our own most of the time. I didn't mind that, and I found the men on the whole great company, but I think it probably caught up with me a bit more than I realised. After leaving the RAF, Hadlow took up her former role of gliding instructor and has her own light aircraft. Of the 5 women featured, 3 completed their engagements as junior officers, 1 left early, and navigator Anne-Marie Houghton continues to serve. Next slide, please. Although she did well in training, she was barred from the fast jet route as she qualified before the ban on combat aircraft was lifted. But she went on to success with 70 Squadron, a tactical Hercules squadron flying low-level missions. Spell as an instructor back at Finningley followed, and she echoed Salter's perception that men and women flourished with different levels of explanation. She went on to the Sentry aircraft, the airborne early warning role. Promotions saw her appointed as a flight commander and then as squadron commander for 54 Squadron, the RAF's intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition and reconnaissance squadron. She accumulated a wealth of operational experience, northern and southern no-fly zones in Iraq, operations in the Balkans in the mid-90s, tours in the Middle East, Staff College in the USA, and a 6-month stint in Afghanistan at the Kabul headquarters. When she was interviewed at the RAF Museum in 2017, she remarked on how proud she was to have been involved with an anniversary of the Battle of Britain. Next slide, please. She topped that experience as the RAF's parade commander as it marked its 100th anniversary in 2018. If her selection caused ripples, it wasn't because of her gender. Rather, it was that the RAF chose a navigator and not a pilot. Attitudes had come a long way in 30 years. So to summarise, having decided to open limited flying roles for women in July 1989, the Ministry of Defence wanted early success and public recognition. Ignoring the experience of close allies, its well-meaning but unhelpful publicity efforts generated the classic and predicted problems for the pioneering women. It added to the already stressful schedule during training and created friction with male colleagues. It encouraged an idea that women didn't want real careers, just the limelight, subjected them to mockery. Efforts to prove that female aircrew retained their femininity only served to highlight the belief that this wasn't a proper environment for women. Women themselves resented the need to participate and certainly didn't want to be set above other trainee aircrew. They just wanted to qualify, wanted to fly military aircraft, and they were not pretending to be men. From the RAF perspective, publicity was part of the package. This was the means by which it could gain kudos with the Equal Opportunities Commission and inspire young women to join. Its failure to provide training in handling the media was an easily avoided own goal. Now, this talk has been based on the women's perspective and official documents. There's a story to tell from the men's perspective. Was there any effort to brief staff on potential management issues? Were leaders encouraged to think through problems that might emerge, or different learning styles? On the surface of it, it would appear not. But there seems to have been buy-in from some, awarding Julie Gibson extra flying hours and basic training, instructor who persuaded his bosses that Joe Salter was fast jet standard, her 617 squadron commander who welcomed her and backed her when an experienced navigator objected to flying with her. And on the other side, there were women's accounts of men who wanted them to fail or resented their success. There's an impression of letting the policy run for a while and everyone will get used to it. But with numbers so small, this added to the strain placed on the women who felt the need to constantly prove that they were there on merit. But all reflect on how much their RAF careers meant to them, supportive colleagues, and the thrill of flying easily outweighing any negative aspects of additional scrutiny that came their way. Perhaps the policy would have gained greater momentum had its introduction not been followed almost immediately by defence cuts following the end of the Cold War. Delays in flying training affecting men and women alike prevented the anticipated build-up, leaving these early qualifiers more isolated than intended. But even here, policy had been framed optimistically in terms of setting a quota of 10%, a figure somewhat plucked from the air rather than grounded in what was achievable, and the service never came close to meeting it. The system also got better at coping with marriage and motherhood so that women felt more able to combine flying and family aspirations. Female pilots and navigators are a part of today's RAF, participating in operational flying, commanding flights and squadrons. Final slide, please. And to finish where I started, winning the coveted Distinguished Flying Cross, as Michelle Goodman's citation read, "Alert to the high risk. but fully conscious of the importance of providing unfailing support to ground forces, Goodman elected to fly her approach to an unfamiliar and dangerous landing site whilst under intense fire. Without her actions, the casualty would have died within 15 minutes. This was a bold and daring sortie, which undoubtedly saved life. Thank you all for tuning in. Harry, back to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Kath. I thought that, I have to say, the story is inspiring. And I don't think that we focus on it enough. Often we look at the ATC when we're looking to tell the story of women, and I think that this is huge relevance, not just to the RAF, but in terms of society when we look at the pace of change. And I'm gonna ask you that question, in fact, when we come back. But I'm going to say to audience, if you hold with us for 5 minutes for Kath's Q&A, and if you're thinking of any particular questions, you can enter them using the Ask a Question function at the bottom. So please do send them in. Kath, I'm going to briefly turn your camera off so you can feel free to do whatever you feel like. And I'm going to welcome Maggie Abson, who's the museum's chief executive, forward to present virtually our academic prizes for 2020. Focus on you, Maggie. So, there you go.
Thank you, Harry. I'd like to also add my thanks to Kathleen. It was a really inspiring and sometimes very sobering reflection. It was also really lovely to see some of the women who've become good friends to the museum and shared their stories with us too. Harry, I don't know if you're getting a lot of feedback, but I am.
Yeah.
Shall I try again?
Yeah, I think if you keep going, Maggie.
Okie doke, thanks, Harry. I've now got the joy of congratulating the winners of the RAF Museum Academic Awards. They're designed to inspire and reward high quality research, so that's really important for us as a national museum. The awards are made to final year students without regard to nationality or academic affiliation, on the recommendation of a selection panel comprising members of the RAF Museum's Research Board. The bursary and prizes are awarded for writing in the field of air power studies in the very broadest sense, encompassing not only the history of air warfare, but also related fields such as archaeology, international relations, strategic studies, and others. And this year's applications were assessed during the course of 2020. So a very big thank you to our panel who made the assessments too. So our first winner is the doctoral bursary winner, Victoria Taylor. Victoria is studying at the University of Hull and Sheffield Hallam University. Congratulations, Victoria, and it's lovely to have you with us. Victoria's PhD was in history and fully funded by the North of England Consortium for Arts and Humanities. Her thesis was entitled "Its Spirit Lives On, the Nazification of the Luftwaffe." Her thesis examines the Luftwaffe during the Third Reich and its legacy in the early post-Second World War period. In general, Victoria's research attempts to understand how the cultural, social, and political repercussions of aeronautical events can be traced in contemporary society. The RAF Museum Selection Panel noted that Victoria's thesis should make an important contribution to the historiography both of the Luftwaffe and of the Nazi Party's methods of subverting non-party state institutions. Victoria's submitted chapter was commended for showing an impressive depth of research, marshalled to form a coherent and convincing argument. We've met before as well because Victoria's previously won the RAF Museum MA Prize for her dissertation entitled Après-moi le déluge, redressing the wartime and post-war mythologization of Operation Chastise in Britain. This research formed the basis of the lecture Victoria provided for the RAF Museum in 2020. And the recording's available on our Crowdcast channel, so please check it out. as well as that forthcoming article for Air Power Review on the RAF and Luftwaffe diplomacy in the interwar period, Victoria has an agreement to contribute a chapter on Winston Churchill's bombing policy for the Cambridge University Press companion to Winston Churchill. Victoria, many congratulations. And our Masters winner now is David Spruce. David studied at the University of Wolverhampton, and his master's degree is in Britain and the First World War. David received his MA with distinction overall. The award included a distinction in his dissertation entitled "The Development of British Air Power on the Western Front to the End of 1915, an analysis of the technological, procedural and tactical developments of the Royal Flying Corps." His MA dissertation was supervised by John Buckley, one of the co-organisers for events held with Wolverhampton. David's research helps fill a gap that existed in the secondary literature related to the service in the early part of the war. His dissertation utilised a broad range of source material and establishes some of the organisational and intellectual strengths of the RAFC in the early war years. David carried out a significant amount of primary research, particularly at the National Archives and at the RAF Museum, citing over 100 archival files in his dissertation. The result was a piece of work that challenged a number of accepted notions of the Air Force in a lucid and well-constructed argument. David's continuing his research and is enrolled on a PhD programme, which John Buckley is again supervising. And David's also had work accepted for publication across Kilcaid. David will provide the final Trenchard lecture in Air Power of 2021 when he discusses the recruitment and training of the Royal Flying Corps. Warm congratulations, David. And finally, our undergraduate prize winner is Nick Black. Nick studied at the University of Suffolk. Congratulations, Nick. His dissertation is entitled Revisiting the Battle of Barking Creek, 6th of September 1939. Nick's dissertation provided an original and forensic microhistorical study of the Battle of Barking Creek, which Nick uses to tell a much bigger and unexpected story. His dissertation was praised for providing a well-written and well-argued piece, which, despite its relatively narrow focus, utilised a wide range of sources to establish insights of wider value to understanding the RAF at the beginning of the Second World War. The chair of our selection panel, Ian Thirst, noted that Nick's dissertation was exceptionally well researched and presented. It certainly expanded my understanding of an incident which has long warranted proper analysis, he said. Nick's previously served in the RAF and then the Suffolk Police before leaving to undertake a full-time degree in 2017. Nick's going to present his research and his dissertation later this year as part of the museum's lecture series. Congratulations, Nick, and to David and Victoria, and I do hope some of our audience will be considering applying for future awards. Warm congratulations to all of you.
Okay, thank you very much, Maggie. Apologies for the slightly ropey sound, but I think it's much nicer that everyone will hear you say those kind words, because they get tired of seeing me. So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for sticking with us. We're going to now say goodbye to Maggie and all of the winners. Very many congratulations. I've had the opportunity to meet Victoria before, and I've swapped emails with both David and Nick, and I'm really excited that both of them are going to offer lectures later in this year. Okay, Kath, the star of the night, I'm going to welcome you back onto the screen so we can take the questions from our audience, which have already come in.
Okay.
I'm going to focus you. Wait for me. Okay. Before I ask
thank you.
those questions, though, I would like to ask.
Can I just add my congratulations to all winners?
Yes. Excellent. Yeah, I'd just like to ask that question about the pace of change.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look back, if historians look back in 100 years' time, do you think they'll say it was an extraordinarily quick pace of change or an extraordinarily slow move, or that it was just a sort of reflection of society in general?
Well, I think when they first considered female aircrew in 1947, that would have been an extraordinarily bold move. It really wouldn't have fitted in with how society was structured in those days. But then I think the British force did fall behind. They were pioneers with the creation of regular service for women. They lost that status in the 1970s when other countries with more advanced equal opportunities lobbies and organisations stole a march on Britain. And I think Britain might be judged to be perhaps 10 or maybe even 15 years behind the curve.
That's interesting. Okay, I want to make sure the audience get to ask questions that they'd like. The first one is, in your opinion, what additional changes does the RAF need to make in order to achieve further and eventually total gender equality within the workplace?
Well, I think it has certainly gone a long way towards that, and the changes in the 1990s were pivotal across all three of the services. It did take quite a long time to get all combat roles open and all jobs open, but they now are all open. Equal pay came in as a consequence of the Navy allowing women to go to sea in warships, again in the beginning of the 90s. So those sorts of big policy things are in place. Maternity leave came into being. They stopped throwing out people of a homosexual leaning only in the year 2000, but that changed. So the sort of big picture stuff has been sorted, but there is always the behind the scenes stuff that is less evident, such as who gets selected for what job, and what job you get selected to do really weighs in importance when it comes to your promotion opportunities. If you've been given the most taxing of jobs and you do well at the most taxing jobs, you stand a better chance of promotion. So I think that sort of whole appointments board thing is still a little bit obscure. So there's probably more work to do there, but I've been out of the system now for a long time. So maybe there's been more progress in that than I know.
I think one of the questions that sprang to my mind before your lecture, and I think bearing in mind your last answer, you might say you aren't able to answer it, is whether or not during this period there was a shift from sexual discrimination based on biological differences through to simply the culture of the RAF remaining very male-centric. Do you think that's correct? Or do you think it's still much more rooted in gender discrimination?
Well, I think that's quite difficult to judge because each station and each squadron will take its tone from its own leadership. And so if there is an intent from the top that everybody should be treated equally and fairly and given opportunity, then that will create the appropriate atmosphere across all the potential discriminations. But if the person at the top is not so committed to an equality agenda, then that becomes pervasive and can influence how things are conducted within a section or within a squadron. A lot depends on leadership, not just at the officer level, but also at the non-commissioned officer level. Makes a big difference.
Okay. Now this question's come in from Martin Underhill, who says that currently, caveats which I think, only 2 senior appointments in the RAF are held by female officers from the flying branch. Could there have been more?
In the flying branch, did you say?
I suppose yes.
It does take a long time to grow these senior commanders. I think one has to remember that the base they're choosing from is extremely small. I'm not sure that the Air Force has ever exceeded 3% of its pilots being female. Probably be about 6% for navigators. So you're talking about a very small number of women who actually get through the system. And then, of course, you have all the wastage, for want of a better word, along the way if people opt out at their break points in their contracts. And so very few stay on to make a career like Anne-Marie Houghton has. So there are not many who will stay in, and that will be for a variety of reasons, some of which we've covered, of course, in the lecture in terms of scrutiny and isolation and family reasons. It's not easy for a combination of family and career aspirations. And so there are not many women who reach the senior ranks to achieve these senior appointments. So those that do are exceptional in many ways.
Okay, that number is quite striking, isn't it? That 3% flying pilots.
Yes.
And I think it's 13% perhaps in general for the RAF.
Yes, it's about 13% with a target of 15%.
And I think this is something which perhaps you can speak on personally, because you did an engineering background, am I right?
I was a training specialist with an engineering background. I wasn't an engineer officer as such.
I'm slightly surprised because we often talk about difficulties in terms of having enough female participation in STEM subjects. But
yes.
Do you think that's less of a problem for the RAF and that actually opening up these flying opportunities is proved more challenging?
I'm not sure what the statistics are for engineering, but when I worked in the engineering schools in the 1980s, the only female student I ever had on a course was an Australian exchange officer.
Really?
When I ran the apprenticeship, avionics apprenticeship at RAF Cosford in the late 80s, the apprenticeship, of course, was not open to girls. The apprenticeship was deemed to be too much training and too expensive to be given to a girl. So it was only open to young men as they came out of school. So I never had, apart from this Australian, I never had a female student either as a technician or as an engineer officer on any of the courses I instructed or was in control of from a management perspective.
Okay. So we've got another question coming from Mark Russell, who says, to what extent do you think that these women were more or less discriminated against than similar pioneers in other fields? Really tricky question to answer, I think. Both service and other sectors, industries. So he says, my sense from Mandy Hickson's book is that the RAF was at least as welcoming as other organisations, bringing women into the key roles in these organisations.
Yes, I mean, of course, my expertise is mostly in what happened in the Navy and in the Army. The Navy, with its separate service for the women, the Women's Royal Naval Service, that was very much like a gilded cage. They were much lauded and appreciated and loved, provided they stayed within their confined status as a shore-based support organisation. So they faced an enormous cultural challenge when it was decided that women would go to sea in warships and would become Royal Navy and not separate. So that was a huge challenge. And a lot of women who went to sea from 1990 onwards found it extremely challenging, very difficult. And again, come back to the leadership issue. they thrived or otherwise according to the tone set by the ship's captain and his executive officer and so on. In the army, I think they are probably just facing up to the challenge now, having only in very recent years opened up the infantry and the armoured corps. And I have no information on the statistics of how that is going and how well that's going. It's very difficult. I suppose the other sort of comparable thing would be the police in this country. And they, very good book by Louise Jackson, who explained what happened with the police. But again, they were, until the 1970s, they were very much expected to look after women's issues. Children who were in difficulties, the sex worker industry and domestic violence, those sorts of things. But with the rise of the social work profession, so there were other people who could take professional interest in these cases, and women police became more integrated into mainstream police service work. So they are, they were a long way ahead of the armed forces modernization, for want of a better word, and have grown, a fair share of chief constables and other senior women, including the Met Police Commissioner today.
So I'd like to come back to the question about these pioneering female aviators we've talked about tonight.
Okay.
How big a role do you think they have had and continue to have in increasing the diversity of the RAF?
I think they've had some good visibility. I mean, not least selecting Anne-Marie Houghton as the parade commander for the most prestigious parade, the 100th anniversary parade. And that's terrific. I don't think they seek the limelight still, and so they wouldn't like to see themselves in those sorts of differentiated terms. But I expect a lot of squadrons scarcely ever have a female aircrew, because the numbers still are so small.
Yeah. Okay. I think, Kath, we've probably got time for one more question.
Okay.
And Ruben, okay, I'm going to ask you this. In terms of when these roles were opened up, there's been some suggestion from sort of research in military sociology at the time that they would be very tokenistic, and sort of school of tokenism as a theory is used in some research on this. I wondered, is your sense from the RAF that was the case? Did they create policies to ensure that happened, or is it simply not the case? I wonder what your take on it is.
I don't think it was intended to be tokenism at all. I think it was a genuine effort to improve the quality of aircrew. They were desperately short of navigators at the time in 1989. Very few men chose navigator as their first choice. It relied upon men who fell out of pilot training to accept being re-rolled as navigator. They never hit their recruiting targets for navigators. And there was a feeling that women would make a significant difference there. And they did. They did make a significant difference in the navigator role. The pilot role, well, they didn't intend it to be a token. They did say 10%, and 10% was pretty close to what the female contingent was in the RAF at the time. The quota used to sit at 8%, and they increased that quota to 9 or 10% in the late 1980s, across the piece, that is. It didn't apply within each branch of work, but as an overall number. So they went with that number. But it bore no relation to what was achievable. I mean, for a start, half of women wouldn't meet the measurement criteria for the cockpits of the training aircraft. They'd be too short, or they wouldn't have enough reach all sorts of reasons why a lot of women just wouldn't meet the criteria. The aircraft were designed to male measurements, they weren't designed for female measurements. So, and this was the experience in America and in Canada and in Australia, which had gone before Britain as well. But that experience wasn't really looked into at all. There was an imperative to get this done, to get it off the equal opportunities agenda, to get it done, and we'll say it's 10%, that should be enough. So they set off with this good idea, but they didn't really explain how they were to achieve 10% when allied nations who'd been running the programs for longer had not come anywhere close to that number either. And then, of course, it was all scuppered by the Cold War ending and the defence cuts, because all of a sudden squadrons were being disbanded, experienced aircrew needed to be redeployed. The remaining squadrons couldn't absorb the number of ab initio pilots coming out of the training machine, and they started having to pay pilots, trainee pilots, to leave. Young men, particularly who'd come out of University Air Squadron cadetships, were being asked to leave and not take up their place. So the whole thing came to a crashing confusion for about 5 years with the end of the Cold War. So it didn't seek to be tokenistic. It was almost by default tokenistic as far as pilots were concerned.
I think it's a really interesting area, both in terms of looking at the RAF and its contemporary history, but also in terms of how diversity can be fostered, because it often seems like ambitious targets are set, but the groundwork, which ends up being the heavy lifting, is left unfulfilled. I think that's the sense that comes through. I want to thank you very much, Kathleen, for an amazingly good talk. I think from the comments on the side we've been getting, it's been hugely appreciated. I should say, do you want to say a few words about your book, because it is fantastic?
Oh, that's very, very kind of you. First, of course, I'd like to thank the 5 women who agreed for me to tell their stories today, because without their permissions, this talk wouldn't have been possible. Yes, so the book covers all 3 services, women on the front line, and it's about the path to combat roles. And it starts with the decision to create regular service after the Second World War, and brings the story right up to about 2016, with the Army opening its final combat roles to women. And it's produced by Amberley. I must give my publisher a name check. So yes, I hope that people find it interesting to hear the backstory, because there's always a temptation to suppose that the things we do today were just, well, of course they would happen, wouldn't they? But it wasn't obvious that it would all happen. And there's a story to tell, particularly the linkages between the 3 services, because each one was a little domino, and as each little domino fell, so another domino fell. And to tell the story on a tri-service basis is what makes my book a little bit different from other volumes that you might find. Thanks for the opportunity to self-publicize.
No, I think it's well warranted. I do think it's an excellent work, particularly academically. I think it's going to be cited enormously. So I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to say that I think it's fantastic. So do everyone rush out and get it. It's linked in our event talk description, but I'm also going to put the link in the comment section so people wandering in can find it. But all that's left, Kath, is to say thank you very much one more time.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Okay, bye.
Good night.